What's up, y'all? So I thought I'd do a quick recap on the history of Unit 825. For those of you that have been following this channel for a long time, you've already heard all this, but I know there's a lot of new subscribers over the last year, and I appreciate everybody that has subscribed and shared my videos, boring though they may be. So there's a lot of information about the mothership, otherwise known as Unit 825, that some of you guys may not know or care about for that matter, but you can always click off this video. So back around, I believe it was August of 18, we bought this truck, the mothership, and drove it for 2 months. And coming down off of I-70 in Colorado on the eastern slope, came down off the mountain, headed out into the valley, made it out to about Kansas, and my coolant light came on. It said critically low coolant level. Well, I had done a pre-trip and I knew my coolant wasn't low unless a mechanical problem had developed. So temperature gauges were fine. They weren't showing that it was running hot. So I drove to the nearest safe spot to pull over and pulled over on the side of the road, popped the hood, and my coolant reservoir, the overflow tank, was black. It was full of engine oil. Now there's several things that can cause that on this engine. One, and the most common, is a bad oil cooler. The oil cooler is mounted on the passenger side of the block, and it looks like a mini radiator, but it's encased with a cover that bolts straight to the side of the block, so you can't see it. Oil circulates around through that. Coolant circulates through the cooler, or around the outside of the cooler, through the block, through the housing of the block, and it uses coolant to cool the oil. So if that little oil cooler thing that looks like a radiator goes bad, it will start passing oil over into the coolant reservoir. And the reason it goes that way is because your coolant system usually runs 14, 16 PSI, somewhere in there. You can vary a little bit. Your oil pressure is 35, 40, 45, somewhere in that range. So of course, it's going to pass through that cooler in the direction of the lowest pressure. Now sometimes you'll get a little bit of coolant into the oil when you turn the engine off, because your coolant system is still pressurized, but your oil pressure suddenly goes to zero. But again, it depends on how the cooler is made as to whether that happens, because a lot of times where the crimps are on the edge, they come down and they crimp, and when the pressure is more, it opens them up from the inside, from this side. But when the pressure on the inside disappears and the pressure on the outside is still there, it kind of keeps it closed. So you may not see a bypass going from the coolant side to the oil side, but it's pretty easy to tell if there's any significant amount, because all you have to do is pull the dipstick and check two things. Well, three things. Check your oil level. If it's raising, that's not a good sign. If it's raising or staying the same level basically, but has turned kind of milky looking, like there's water in the oil or coolant in the oil, then that's a bad sign. Or if when you take the radiator cap off and you flip it over and look at it and there's a lot of condensation on the bottom of that, that's not a good sign either. There shouldn't be any condensation there. So But again, you may not always see a bypass onto the oil side, but yet have oil in the coolant side. Now, you can have a blown head gasket, you can have a crack in the block or the head, or you could have a dropped liner. A dropped liner means that the replaceable sleeve that slides down into the block the piston sits inside of has dropped an O-ring, a seal, around that liner that prevents the bypass of fluids going in the wrong direction. But usually, if you have a dropped liner, you'll also see coolant in the oil. So I wasn't seeing any coolant in the oil. And since all my pressures and temperatures were okay, I knew that I could get a definitive diagnosis a little bit farther down the road. Went on down into Texas, kept a close eye on oil levels and coolant levels, made my deliveries, and drove up to the Witchitah Falls area because I had a trainee with me that lived in Witchitah Falls. So I figured, why not let him go home, spend time with his family while the truck was getting diagged and repaired. So we pulled into the Volvo dealer there, and they said, yep, it's a oil cooler. They replaced the oil cooler, and I hit the road. Headed back up into Colorado, made it up to Denver. In Denver, the critical oil coolant light, no, I'm sorry, it didn't come on at that point. I was just keeping an eye on it, and I noticed that there was a little bit of oil in the top of the reservoir. By a little bit, I mean maybe a quarter inch, which is far more than it should be. But when you have a severely contaminated coolant system, there's always the chance that the system wasn't completely flushed and some of those contaminants are finding their way to the top because oil floats on the top of water or coolant. Well, when I took it into the Volvo dealer there, and of course they warranted, did a flush on it, and we hit the road. Drove all the way up into Washington and over back down into Bend, Oregon. And as I came down off the mountain, critically low coolant light came on again. This time, my temperature gauge was rising a little bit. So I pulled over the side of the road and got out and checked, and sure enough, the reservoir was full again. Now the reason that the critical low coolant level light comes on when there's still coolant and oil in the reservoir is because oil tricks the sensor into believing that there's no coolant in the reservoir, even though there is. So I knew at that point, since the temperature was beginning to elevate this time and it hadn't before, that I was going to have to do something to get a definitive diagnosis and repair. So I got online looking, and there was a Volvo dealer about 59 miles, I think it was, ahead of me, down in Redding, California. So I drove down there, told them what the problem was. I said it was kind of late. Now I pulled in and I parked out front. First thing the next morning I went in. They said, yeah, we should be able to have you a diagnosis either today or tomorrow. So we dropped the truck, went to a motel. I believe I'd have to go back and refresh on the story on that one, but if I remember right, it was about 3 days later or so before it ever made it in the shop for them to start looking at it. And long story short, they pulled the cooler again, the oil cooler, and they tested it. Which of course it was a brand new cooler, but you want to test it, you do the most obvious first, and it passed the pressure test. So then they called the Witchitah Falls dealer and spoke with them. Well, they still had the old cooler because it hadn't been that long. Well, they tested the oil cooler and found that there was nothing wrong with it. So we immediately knew that rather than testing, they simply threw parts at the problem and it didn't fix it. That was a $4,600 repair that did no good. And it took, I believe, about 3 days in Wichita Falls. So we looked it over carefully, and there was an O-ring on the backside of the oil cooler that looked like it may be damaged, and looked like there may have been oil bypassing there. So they put it back together, which would have had to do anyway no matter what else they did, and they flushed the system, and they said, okay, you got a couple options. They said, we think it might be something else, but we don't know for sure because of that potential bad O-ring. Would you like us to tear farther into the engine, or do you want to go out and test it for a while? This was 10 days after I had dropped it off there for a 12-hour book job. I said, no, I don't want to leave it here. I want to go out and test it. Because if there was something else wrong with it, I could always repeat the process and go back to another dealer. But at that point, we would know that the oil coolant system was completely ruled out. So I drove all the way down to San Diego, and I came all the way back up, picked up a load of Teslas, and headed out over I-80. Dropped down into Reno, down off the Sierras, got down through Reno, critical low coolant light came on again. So I noticed there was a pattern of this always happened right after coming down off a mountain, with all of the back pressure running the Jake brakes built up in the cylinders, creating the excessive pressures there somehow, or at least it seemed to be a pattern. Well, at this point I knew there was something more serious, and I decided to try to drive it to Salt Lake, which was the nearest Volvo dealer the direction that I was going, and ended up blowing a heater hose, which if you go back and look at the $17,000 head gasket video that I have, you'll see the mess that made inside the truck when the heater hose blew. Because the heater hoses are not made for petroleum products, they're made for coolant products, and when the petroleum gets in there, eventually it will start softening it. You can have it in there one time, maybe twice, it gets flushed back out quickly and not be a problem. But over time, if it sits for any length of time, it's going to soften those hoses to where they start swelling. You'll see them swelling around the clamp areas, and they're squishy, and they're just, you can tell they are needing replaced. So when that one blew, it was a sign that it had gone as far as it could go. So I called a wrecker truck, towed it to Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake City said they could have me a diagnosis within 24 hours. Of course they didn't, but they did pressure test the block, which was a crucial part in determining where the problem may be. So according to Volvo's website, if I remember correctly, proper pressure is like 40 to 60 psi that you pressurize the coolant system. You let it set for about 8 hours, 8 to 12 hours, and you check the oil pan. Or if you've pulled the oil pan, you look at the floor underneath it and you see if there's any coolant that has dripped on the floor, and you look up inside the block around the liners and you see if there's any coolant running down and dripping off those liners. If there is, then you know you have a dropped liner, a blown oil seal O-ring around that metal liner. Well, if they pressurized, according to their paperwork, to something like 120 or 140 psi, which is essentially double the pressure that you're supposed to pressurize it at, and it still passed the test. And since it didn't appear to do any damage, I wasn't worried about the overpressure, and I actually thought maybe it was a good thing because it really proved that there was no dropped liner. Well, So they said, we really believe it's going to be a head gasket. I said, okay, so what are we looking at cost-wise if it's a head gasket and nothing more? They said to replace a head gasket and all of the coolant hoses, which means everything from radiator lines to the hoses going back, clear back to the heater bunk in the rear. And they said between $7,500 and $8,000 is what we believe that's going to cost. I said, okay, let's pull it down and diagnose it, make sure that's what it is. A couple days later, they called me back and said, we have confirmed that it is in fact a head gasket, and they sent me some pictures. And you could visibly see the blown area of the head gasket between a oil orifice and a coolant orifice going through the head gasket. You can see the bypass area where it was passing through there. So I said, okay, great, let's get this put back together. They said, well, we need $17,000 first. I said, why? What else did you find? They said, we didn't find anything else, but we need $17,000 before we proceed in case we find something else. I said, that's not how this works. If you find something else, then we add that to the invoice. And if you need some money up front at that point for that extra, then that's fine. But nobody pays for the complete job at a dealer before the job has been done. They said, well, you can either pay it or you can tow it. And I thought, boy, that is some mob tactics right there. They get you over a barrel, then they more than double the price without anything else being wrong with it. And they know they're in a bowl. We're talking Salt Lake City. There's not much else you can go to short of a long tow bill. And they know most drivers are probably not going to do that. So they pay the extra money. Well, I talked with my boss and he said, nope, we're going to tow it. Well, I thought I'd try one more time to resolve the issue. So I called Volvo corporate that was over a number of Volvo dealers in that region. I believe like 4 of them. I got a lady on the line that said she was a manager high up in the company, and I explained the situation. I was very polite, courteous, just asking questions about, I've never run into this before. I'm just trying to understand this process and why the price would more than double when the original suspected diagnosis was in fact what we had. Well, her response at that point was, well, sir, it sounds like you no longer trust us, so I don't believe it's in our best interest to work on your truck. How quickly can you have it removed from our property? I mean, what kind of business is that? When you're more than doubling your price with no legit reason? Yeah, I'm starting to question your business practices. And then when you tell me I can either pay these extortion rates or remove my truck from the property, yeah, that really causes anybody to question it. And while I was standing there at the counter, there was another guy in there dealing with the exact same issue, and he was threatening them with an attorney because of how badly they were treating him. And then I got online looking, and there was a lot of other drivers complaining about the same type of extortion tactics. And I get that if you check reviews, you're going to find drivers that are unhappy simply because they had to spend money on their truck, even though the prices were fair, market value. Somebody out there is always going to complain. I get that. But when you're starting to see a pattern of questionable business ethic complaints, that's a problem. So we towed it to a dealer we've used in the past. And spent quite a bit of money on the tow bill. And the boss believed he'd be able to save some money by doing that. Well, as you guys know that have been watching lately, 14 months later, and over $50,000 in a complete rebuild, we get the truck back, even though it was only a blown head gasket. So what happened was the parts were all loaded back in the truck. The tow truck driver went and got the truck, took it back to our other dealer, the problem was they kept the head gasket, so there was no head gasket. When it got to the other dealer, I tried to call them and explain the story up to that point, because as a mechanic in the past, I always hated to get a basket case. A basket case is when somebody's torn everything apart and all the parts are in a basket. Now I've got to try to find the parts and put it all back together and determine what was wrong with it. So essentially at that point, the dealer that it went to had a basket case. And not only did they have a basket case, but they didn't have a head gasket to look at. So they had to assume that maybe there was something wrong with the block. The block was cracked. Up to that point, I'm totally with them. I get their line of reasoning. Well, here's where it goes south with this deal. I try to call them. I say, hey, this is Bobby with D-Line, and I am wanting to talk to one of the techs about this truck. Give you the backstory. As soon as they heard who it was, they said, we don't have time to talk to you, and they hung the phone up. Repeatedly over the next several weeks, I tried to call and left voicemails for upper management. Tried to get in touch with them. And then I heard that they were going to charge us $5,000 to tear the block down to do a complete inspection of the block to make sure it wasn't cracked. Otherwise, they couldn't warranty any work they did. I understand that with the lack of information they had. So again, I tried to call them. I was never able to speak to somebody about the fact the block had already been tested and passed the test with flying colors until after the block had been torn down. And I spoke to a couple of guys in the service department who would immediately hang up on me. And I'm like, guys, I've never done business with y'all before. Why do you have this attitude towards me? I had never even spoken to them on the phone until my truck went in the shop. And then on my very first call, they hung up on me. Come to find out later, they had heard my story that I put on YouTube about what happened at Salt Lake, and somehow got their wires crossed that I was talking about them. Well, I'd never had my truck at their place. And I clearly stated in that video exactly where the Salt Lake incident had taken place. So I guess they were offended by that, didn't want to talk to me. Well, by the time I was, months later, finally able to speak to somebody, they had already disassembled the block and determined there was nothing wrong with it. After taking time and grinding down different little casting marks to make sure they weren't cracked, I mean, a lot of hours and hours and hours of expense went into this rule out a cracked block process. They had even spent time and documented in their notes that they had, and of course they charged us for this, that they had looked for other shops that could pressure test a block that had already been disassembled, and they were unable to find one. All the while, I'm paying for this when I'd already paid for it once. Well, finally, after the engine had been disassembled, I was able to speak with somebody in upper management and get all of the information to them. And he said, man, if we had known all of this, if we had been able to see this picture of the head gasket, if we had had the paperwork from Salt Lake showing they had already pressure tested, if we had had all of this information, we could have just put a head gasket on it, flushed the system, and put this truck back on the road. And I said, yes, I know. That's why I have tried to call. Well, by that point, the engine was disassembled, and nobody's going to put old pistons and liners back in a block. Well, now they had us over a barrel, and a rebuild was the only reasonable option. So rebuild it was. And 14 months later, we got the truck back. The truck is running great. It really is. It did appear, at least at this point, I probably have 7,000 miles on the rebuild. And it's a believe they called it a level 4. Anyway, it's the essential, the same warranty as buying a crate engine, which I could have bought through my shop at that point that I had for $23,000 delivered to my shop. A crate engine, Volvo, with a warranty, installed it myself, but I wasn't allowed that opportunity. So, be that as it may, we're double the money in now. And at that point, I owned a semi-truck shop. I had an account with Volvo where I purchased parts on a regular basis, brought in and put on my trucks or customers' trucks. And I could have bought a D16 crate engine for $23,000. And I was a low volume buyer through them. I don't know what a high volume buyer could have got it for. But that just shows you how bad I got screwed. Now, in their defense, they did more than just a simple rebuild. They did replace the radiator, the rear bunk blower assembly, anything and everything that had been contaminated, whether it could have easily been cleaned or not, got replaced. So there was a lot more work and parts than just a rebuild. But they also put a dash cluster, a gauge cluster in the truck, and forgot to program it. I had to get that done at another dealer here last week. But overall, they did a good job on the rebuild. So, at least it appears at this point that they did. They ran it through all the break-in procedures properly, so oil consumption was very minimal at the beginning. Starts and runs great. I mean, it's a full rebuild with a 350,000 mile warranty, 4-year warranty. Of course, I'll hit 350,000 long before I hit 4 years, or at least I would expect to. At any rate, I wanted to go back to Witchitah Falls. I told you earlier they had made a mistake in the way they failed to diag the problem and simply threw parts at it. So in this process, 2 of the dealers that were involved really went above and beyond. Witchitah Falls, once I found out everything that had taken place, I was stuck in Salt Lake City, and we knew what the problem was. We had a definitive diagnosis. I put together an email along with the photographs of the head gasket, and I sent it to Witchitah Falls. Very polite. I just told the story. I wasn't low class. I didn't cuss. I wasn't angry. I was very professional. Explained everything that took place. Explained to the management that was going to read the email how their technician had done a good job replacing the oil cooler, but had not done a good job on the diagnosis. And so they called me and told me how impressed that they were with the email that I had put together. And I'm not going to disclose the amount that he offered, because I was, at this point, I was approaching 30 days of downtime. And I apologize for this camera bouncing so much. I'm off on a side road now. It's a bit bumpier. So I was out 30 days in gross revenue. Just gross revenue. I was out $4,600, and 3 days out of that 30 on the oil cooler at their shop. And just overall, it had been a bad deal because they had failed to properly diagnose it the first time. So he offered me what I considered an extremely reasonable offer without any haggling. Now, it wasn't as much as I lost total, but he even paid the wrecker bill that got me to the Salt Lake City shop. And he did this without either party having an attorney involved or even threatening attorneys. Just real stand-up good business. So I highly recommend, if you have a problem, take it back. Take it to Witchitah Falls if you can. Yeah, he made a mistake on the diag, but I would assume that as much as that cost them, that they dealt with that issue in a very productive manner, and that they're no longer, and I'm not saying that every tech in there, just the tech that worked on mine, super nice guy, but he just made a simple human error, and it cost his company a lot of money. But they really treated the customer right, and I would never hesitate to go back there again, even with the mistake they made. I wouldn't hesitate for a minute, because I know that they're going to treat me right. So the reason I knew they hadn't programmed the cluster, the dash cluster, correctly was because some of the functions weren't working on it. It wouldn't give me a fuel mileage average readout. It would give me my instant readout, but not my average. And so when I called them, they told me to give it a little time. It has to have a few miles to calibrate. They said probably at least a couple thousand. Well, it shouldn't take a couple thousand, but by the time I called them, I already had probably close to 4,000. I put another 1,000 on it, and then I stopped at a dealer, and they hooked the computer up to it, and were able to quickly determine what the problem was, do a quick update when it was done, and we were chit-chatting about the truck, because it is a little bit of a standout truck. It's not your average normal truck, and they were talking about the D16 and, you know, the fact that it had just been rebuilt. And told him just a little bit of the story, and it's like, wow, man, you've had nothing but bad luck on this. Just all we did was a quick update it to the computer. Wasn't a big deal. Just get out of here. So they didn't even charge me for it. And from the moment I walked in, they were smiling and friendly. Not that professional, hi, how are you, what can I do for you today? But chit-chat, genuinely friendly. And then when they treated me the way they did with the invoice, or lack thereof, it just fit the whole story. I was also looking on their wall, and they were dealer of the year for that entire region a while back. Well, I understand it. With an attitude like that towards their customers, and that type of genuinely friendly floor management dealership, it tells the story that upper management is also quality, because management trickles down. If your staff is not friendly, you can bet their management isn't friendly to them. So, if you guys ever need Volvo, Mack, or even light to medium duty GMC repair work done, the network of dealers for the above mentioned product lines in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, from my experience, I would highly recommend. So anyway, that's a whole lot of talking. I know I've been going on for almost 35 minutes, but I just want to give all of you new subscribers a backstory on the mothership and how it got to where it is now with a brand new engine in it. So, y'all have a good one. Keep between the lines, keep the greasy side down. I'll see you on another one.